born August 7th, 1560, to the noble Bathory family, a prominent Hungarian bloodline. The Blood Countess, as she is often referred to today, is regarded as one of the most sadistic serial killers in history, even holding a place in the Guinness Book of Records as the most prolific female serial killer to date. Her legend has become larger than life, and separating fact from folklore is nearly impossible. The most famous stories involve Elizabeth either bathing in or drinking the blood of her young victims, a practice that is said to have come about after an incident in which Elizabeth beat a young handmaiden with a hairbrush. When Elizabeth caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, she delusionally believed the teenager's blood, which had splattered her face, gave her a more youthful complexion. She immediately ordered a bath to be drawn and the girl's throat to be slashed in order to make full use of this new cosmetic discovery. It was rumored that even as a child, Elizabeth was prone to fits of rage, and it is theorized that she may have suffered from some form of mental illness. At the age of 11, she was engaged to the son of a prominent baron in an arranged marriage negotiated by her own father. Her husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, gifted her the castle that would later serve as her prison following her murder trial in 1611. Their 29-year marriage ended in January of 1604 when Nadasdy died of a mysterious illness. Elizabeth was no stranger to loneliness, however. Nadasdy had been appointed chief commander of the Hungarian army just 3 years after their wedding. Many speculated that this allowed Elizabeth the time and opportunity to develop her sadistic tastes, keeping company with family members and advisors involved in witchcraft, devil worship, and even pedophilia while her husband was at war. There are 3 films that I'll be reviewing in this video. 2 are based on the life of Elizabeth Bathory, and the other merely takes inspiration from her myth. The first film I'll be looking at is Bathory, Countess of Blood. It's the first of 2 biographies, although I'm not sure I would call this one a biography, since so much of it has been invented completely from fiction, and some historical evidence has been ignored or manipulated in order to support the conspiracy theory that Elizabeth was not only innocent of torturing and murdering servant girls, but in some respects even saintly. While I do like the conspiracy theory angle, and Elizabeth was most likely nowhere near as barbaric as her real-life trial or her fictional legend has made her out to be, it's hard to believe that she wasn't a cruel and disturbed murderer at the very least. There are acts of cruelty in the film, but always with justifiable reason. When Elizabeth finds out her husband has been sleeping with the maidservants, she orders that all the girls be whipped out of hurt and anger. She holds a girl's hand over a flame, but again it's out of anger and frustration at the girl's lies and her lover's betrayal. And finally, when she does begin down a murderous path, it is halted after her first kill, and is not by choice, but rather she is under the influence of the witch Darvulia, who keeps Elizabeth so heavily drugged with the promise of curing the sickness within her blood that Elizabeth cannot separate dreams from reality. I'd like to say that I enjoyed the film despite the creative license the filmmakers have taken with the historical facts, but I didn't. The portrayal of Elizabeth as a tragic, hard-done-by victim/hero isn't necessarily a bad thing. The character is interesting, she's just not Elizabeth Bathory, and it's not done very well. Anna Friel does a reasonable job of playing the part of Elizabeth, and I use the word reasonable because although I wouldn't deem it as a bad portrayal, it's far from a stellar one or even a good one. Carl Roden, who plays the part of Thurzo, Elizabeth's biggest rival, the film's main villain, and the man who oversaw the real-life investigation into her crimes, sits just below Anna with what I would describe as half-decent acting. Some scenes are pretty good, others not so good. which is more than I can say for most of the supporting cast, which were not so good at best. It is worth considering that my more favorable opinions of the leading actors could be due in part to the abysmal comparison created by their co-stars. The poor character portrayals cannot be blamed entirely on the actors, however. The film is needlessly long, which is not automatically a flaw, but there are a number of unnecessary scenes and threads that could have been trimmed down. Making the right cuts in the right places could have lessened the amount of poorly scripted and badly acted distractions, helping the film to flow better and be more believable. A lot of effort was put into the costume and set designs, and most of the special effects were done quite well. The film could have been so much better if the writing, directing, and acting had made the best use of the stage. The film's story is separated into 3 sections, each revolving around a person that contributed to Elizabeth's downfall. The sections are connected by a narrator, a monk named Peter who appears in the chronicled story himself in sections 2 and 3, accompanied by his strange howling apprentice. Neither of the monks are historical characters, and their comical nature, along with Peter's collection of bizarre inventions, not only distract from the main story, but also make it hard to take the film seriously and establish darker tones. The first section of the story is supposed to be about Elizabeth's relationship with her husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, but ends up focusing far more attention towards her unconvincing love affair with an Italian painter Ferenc has stolen from the Turks as a gift to her. The painter goes from slave to friend to lover with no real sense or reason, and the chemistry between the two characters is non-existent. It almost seemed as if the only reason the romance exists is to allow references to be made about how Elizabeth's beauty will never fade in painted portraits. Meanwhile, Ferenc is crowbarred into part 1 with a badly staged rape scene, followed by meaningless battle sequences and truly awful letter writing scenes, making as many references as possible to the terrible war against the Turks and how long it has lasted. Part 2 focuses on Elizabeth's relationship with Darvulia, a character the real Elizabeth Bathory did associate with, who was rumored to be a practicer of witchcraft. This section of the story is better than the first, but Elizabeth's drug-addled descent into insanity make it feel disjointed and confusing. The final third of the movie centers around Elizabeth's actual downfall at the hands of Thurzo. It's probably the best part of the movie, and there are scenes I really liked and just wish could have been acted more convincingly. I also like that Thurzo was in love with Elizabeth from the very beginning, fully admitting his desire for her in the final chapter. It makes their rivalry far more personal and adds extra weight to the story's climax. The film definitely got better as it went on. It just went on far too long, and the things I liked about it weren't really worth wasting 2 hours and 20 minutes of my life for. Next, I want to take a look at Stay Alive, a generic slasher horror film from 2006 that sticks pretty close to the formula of generic teen slasher movies. What sets this film apart from the pack, however, is the killer. Normally the killer would be one of the characters within the main teen group, or a teacher no one suspected except pretty much everyone watching, or a mass killer with their own mythology created specifically for the movie franchise. In Stay Alive, however, the killer is the vengeful ghost of Elizabeth Bathory, who has returned to continue her reign of terror via the mysterious underground video game called Stay Alive. There is a lot I could say about this film. Unfortunately, not a lot of it is good. It falls short in the areas you would expect it to. The characters are shallow and cliched at best and downright annoying at their worst. The plot is a little on the stupid side and a hell of a lot on the predictable side, but perhaps the biggest criticism I have is that it is slightly ripping off A Nightmare on Elm Street with the whole die in the game and die the same way in the real world concept. I am a big fan of the Elm Street franchise, but I am the first to admit the series is packed full of cheesy dialogue and second-rate acting. Like a lot of successful slasher movies, however, this can be forgiven due to the exceptional and imaginative practical effects on display. something that is severely lacking in Stay Alive. The CG effects are for the most part really good, and I'm certainly not against CG if it's done well and used in a way that is believable. I loved the graphics used on the video game sequences. I also liked the quick glimpses of the game world bleeding into the real world, but towards the end of the film, the zombie girls taking center stage just didn't work. We see too much of them for too long, and they are far too fake to be frightening. A less is more classic only see the monster in close-up glimpses style would have worked a lot better, allowing the audience's imagination to complete the special effects in the most believable way. As for Stay Alive's Elizabeth Bathory, I have mixed feelings. The legend has been altered to allow the story to take place in the United States. However, the writers have stayed true to the core aspects of Elizabeth's legend, recounting the story of how she first discovered the cosmetic effects of bathing in virgin's blood after stabbing a clumsy handmaiden to death in a fit of temper, a common alternative to the hairbrush beating origin story. I also liked that they maintained the historical incarceration within her own estate as the ending to her legend, and the appearance of the alleged diary said to list the names of all of her victims. I can't really say there's anything I dislike about Stay Alive's Elizabeth. It is strange watching a slasher movie with an entirely CG killer, but the CG Elizabeth is rendered exceptionally well, and given the film's video game plot, I think it was a necessary approach. I didn't feel like she had quite enough realism to build my fear factor, but I honestly don't think a live-action version would have done any better. She also lacked the screen time usually afforded to slasher villains. However, given what I mentioned about the zombie girls, leaving me wanting more may have been a smart move. All in all, I do like Stay Alive. It's got a few weak points, but it's fun and somewhat creepy. It merges a video game feel into live action better than a lot of video game movies, and although it pales in comparison to the best slashers, it shines through the worst, and for lack of a better phrase, is the best of the bad, in my opinion. The final film I'll be reviewing is The Countess, and it's by far my favorite. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's about as perfect as an Elizabeth Bathory story can be. It makes a lot of the same moves as Bathory Countess of Blood, only it makes those moves work. Again, we're looking at a semi-biographical movie that takes in both the sparse historical facts and the rich fictional legend and merges the two together to form a captivating story. Some historical elements have been tweaked and embellished, and a fair amount of new material has been invented completely out of thin air. The difference between the framework for this film and Bathory Countess of Blood, however, is that these liberties have been taken in order to create a story and a main character that makes sense, motivations that are believable and add depth to both Elizabeth's character and the story itself. Bathory, Countess of Blood, tries incredibly hard to convince the audience that Elizabeth Bathory was innocent of all wrongdoing, however improbable that may be. The Countess simply tries to entertain the audience with a captivating story that is well constructed and believable. It is refreshing to be able to break down a film and not find a single fault. Instead, I have a long list of things that I feel were executed to great effect. There is a real poetic essence to the story that has been laced through the dialogue and propelled with great feeling by the actors. The film flows quickly with no unnecessary detours, yet it doesn't feel rushed. Elizabeth's character is fully fleshed, and even though there isn't a great deal of focus on the supporting characters, none feel neglected, and what presence they do have on screen is meaningful. I love that the film doesn't dwell on Elizabeth's early life. We get a brief glimpse at her childhood and an introduction to her married life and children, but within the first 5 minutes of the film her husband Ferenc takes ill and dies, leading into the main body of her story, her years as a widow. In my opinion, this 5-minute introduction to her character is all that is needed, and anything beyond would have only distracted from more important plot points. Like Bathory, Countess of Blood, the Countess portrays Elizabeth as a tragic figure, but unlike in the former, she is also a woman that is deeply disturbed, overwhelmed by paranoia, and downright frightening. What begins as a romantic drama quickly leads into a nightmarish tale of obsession. The film succeeds in creating sympathy for Elizabeth, while at the same time portraying a mental instability and rage so believable it cements her as a monstrous and mad murderess worthy of fear. The Countess follows the historical letter of Elizabeth's downfall at the hands of Thurzo, and although Thurzo doesn't have a huge on-screen presence in The Countess, his underhanded plot against Elizabeth and his role in dismantling both her reputation and her sanity are well enough stated. I do really like how Elizabeth's romantic affairs have been cleverly written to develop her character and give plausible and intriguing explanations to the development of her legend. Casting Darvulia as not only an advisor suspected of witchcraft in the service of Elizabeth, but also as a female lover to the Countess, a voice of reason that is constantly dismissed and threatened, yet stays because she truly is in love with Elizabeth, makes Darvulia an even more tragic character than Elizabeth herself. And by making Darvulia younger than Elizabeth, it fuels the vanity and jealousy that drives Elizabeth's development all the more. Of course, the core catalyst to Elizabeth's descent into vanity and murder is the character of Istefan, the young son of the man who will eventually bring on her downfall, Count Thurzo. This love story is the main body of the film, and it works so well. The fact that Elizabeth falls in love with a man some 18 years her junior is a wonderful way to explain the origin of her vanity obsession. The heartbreak that ensues when Istefan's father leads Elizabeth to believe her deepest fears that her young lover has abandoned her opens the door to a steady decline into rage and cruelty. Appetites that are encouraged by her masochistic lover, Dominic, sent by Thurzo to ensure that there is enough evidence of real cruelty from which further lies can be fabricated. I think a big part of why this film comes together so well is because it has an uninterrupted singular vision, that of its writer/director Julie Delpy, who also stars in the film as Elizabeth herself. I love when a writer takes full reins of directing a film because it shows that they are incredibly passionate and believe wholly in their own vision. In the case of The Countess, Julie Delpy takes that passion a step further still by also taking on the lead role. That is something I have immense respect for, regardless of whether or not I like the vision itself. But with a movie that takes such an iconic legend and fully fleshes out the psychology of the character behind it with gripping drama and frightening realism, I am truly in awe. If you only see one movie on this list, make it this one. Between the years of 1602 and 1604, rumors of Elizabeth's atrocities ran rampant through the kingdom of Hungary, with one Lutheran minister in particular leading a furious campaign against her, publicly voicing his complaints and accusations. Finally, in 1610, the King of Austria ordered an official investigation into the claims against her. However, several factors regarding this order have left a question mark next to the evidence gathered and given rise to conspiracy theories surrounding her guilt. Firstly, Elizabeth's wealth and land holdings rivaled that of the king, who coincidentally owed her a sizable debt for her husband's military investments. Secondly, she was a Protestant woman of high stature in a male-dominated era, serving under a Catholic monarch who sought to gain increased favor with Rome. Thirdly, the man appointed to oversee the investigation into her guilt was perhaps her biggest political rival, a man who stood to gain greatly from Elizabeth's downfall. Finally, there is the fact that Elizabeth herself was never brought to trial. Instead, 4 accomplices were tried in a way that implicated Elizabeth in the torture and murder of an undeterminable number of victims, and a deal was struck that would see her wealth and land divided between Hungarian nobility rather than being seized by the Catholic Church or inherited in full by her children. The reasoning for this decision was cited as being that Elizabeth's execution would have had too much of a negative effect on the political structure of Hungary's nobility. It is still hard, however, to discount the sheer volume of evidence amassed. During the trial of Elizabeth's accomplices, more than 300 witness testimonies were documented. According to all witness accounts, the first victims were daughters of local peasants, lured in by offers of paid work as maidservants. Elizabeth then branched out to include daughters of lesser gentry sent to her to be schooled in proper etiquette, and young peasant girls abducted by her accomplices. Some witnesses were relatives of noble and peasant girls who had died or disappeared while in Elizabeth's service. Others reported seeing evidence of torture on the bodies of young girls removed from her estates. 2 key witnesses even testified to having seen the Countess torture and kill servant girls with their own eyes. When authorities arrived at Chatice Castle to arrest Elizabeth, they reported to having found 1 girl dead, 1 dying, 1 wounded, and several imprisoned. A more extensive search of the grounds would turn up more physical evidence that would support the testimony taken from witnesses and survivors during and prior to the trial of her accomplices. The horrific acts committed by Elizabeth and her 4 accomplices, corroborated by physical evidence and consistent witness testimony, include burning and mutilation by use of hot irons, coins, and keys, severe beatings, biting of the victims' faces and other body parts, freezing and starving victims to death, and torturous use of needles and other stabbing implements. There is no testimony or account, however, to Elizabeth bathing in or drinking the blood of any of her victims, and although these vampiric traits are often presented as factual, her legendary obsession with blood and beauty, as well as her title as the Blood Countess, weren't invented until long after her death. It has never been possible to determine the exact number of victims. Even modern-day estimates vary greatly. At the time of her trial, the official body count was ruled to be 80, but this was a conservative estimate. According to the testimony of those on trial, Elizabeth tortured and murdered girls at a number of properties. Castle personnel at just one of these locations reported an estimate of between 100 and 200 bodies removed from the castle. One servant also testified to having cited a diary kept by Elizabeth that listed the names of more than 650 murdered girls. However, the location of said diary is still unknown, and hence its existence cannot be proven. The trial concluded with 3 of Elizabeth's accomplices sentenced to death. 2 were burned at the stake, 1 was beheaded, and the 4th accomplice was deemed to be the least culpable and sentenced only to life in prison. Elizabeth herself was spared from both a trial and a death sentence, but not from imprisonment. She was bricked within a set of rooms within her own castle until her sudden and mysterious death 4 years later. On the evening of August 21st, 1614, she complained to her guard of having cold hands and was found dead by causes unknown the following morning. That's all from me. I hope that you found some insight in this video. Until next time, thank you for watching.